All right, let's get going. So I'm Don Graves, president of the Gila, what do we call ourselves? Native Plant Society. And boy, this is our the first time we've been at Harlan Hall for quite some time. And we're a hybrid tonight. So we've got 21 or 22 screens on Zoom and 23 or 25 people in here. So that's pretty good. 27. Okay, very good. So this is the last program until October. That's what we generally do. And we'll start up with our programs again. But we do hope to have field trips this summer and fall. Right now, we're just crossing our fingers that the fires stay away and go out and don't rekindle and all of that stuff, because most of our prime wildflower hike areas are in the Gila. So many of the national forests have already level 3, which means they are closed. We're at level 2 now, I think. So we'll see what happens. So those of you that are members will see our field trips in the paper or get an email, and then the rest of you will see that in the paper when they happen. But our first field trip, I wanted to get something before the end of May, is Nava Konigsberg, who has been instrumental in forming our traditional healing garden, is going to do 2 different sessions at the Silver Creek Botanical Garden on Saturday and Sunday, May 28 and 29. We're only going to allow 12 people on Saturday, 12 people on Sunday. So if you would like to participate in one of those, you should talk about the overview of the Silver Creek Botanical Garden and then describe the plants in the traditional healing garden. So you can notify us at gilanative@gmail.com if you'd like to participate on one of those days, right? And we'll be sending out that announcement soon. But we'd like you to submit your questions using the chat. And those of you that are here live, remember them, write them down, and we'll see what Russ wants to do about asking. Okay, if you have a question, just put up your hand. And just don't take over the session so we can keep it moving, all right? And sorry folks on Zoom, but we're having refreshments afterwards. So without further ado, Russ Kleinman, the beautiful Penstemons of the Gila.
Thanks, Don. Can everybody back there hear me? The only thing is, with it being this dark, I'm not going to be able to see your hand going up very well. So you may have to wave at me a little bit for me to know you have a question. So, beautiful Penstemons of the Gila. Can we close that door, Don? Get my glare out of there. So, beautiful Penstemons of the Gila. It's really quite an honor to be able to talk about a single genus. I don't get to talk about a single genus very often, particularly a genus that's this pretty. If you think about the genera that have enough species in them in the Gila to talk about, you only have a few, right? There's a lot of astragalus. Who's heard of astragalus? A few of you. Who's heard of Muhlenbergia? A few of you. Who's heard of Carex? Even fewer probably, except for 1 or 2 who work with it. But Penstemons, everybody's heard of, right? It's a wonderful subject. It's a bunch of beautiful flowers. We get to talk for a whole hour about them. It's a subject of debate, exactly how many species there are of just about any genus, but there are about 270, between 260 and 280 species of Penstemons in the world. It kind of depends upon who you read and whether they consider a subspecies or a subgenus, not a subgenus, a subspecies or a variety to be a species or not. But if you go with somewhere around 270 species of Penstemons in the world, you're doing pretty good. It's the third largest genus in North America behind Carex and Astragalus. In terms of how many we have in the Gila, and I know some of you online are not in Southwest New Mexico, but I'm going to pitch the talk in terms of most of the pictures to Southwest New Mexico. 20 of them are here in the Gila, roughly. About 240 of them are north of the border with Mexico. That means about 30 or 40 are south of the border with Mexico. And there's one as far as south as Guatemala. There used to be one species of Penstemon that was recognized in Japan and a few other parts of Asia. That has now been put into a different genus. And so all the Penstemons are basically North America and down to Guatemala. And it was a fair thing to do. It turns out there are lots of reasons why that particular Japanese quote unquote Penstemon has been moved. It was a valid thing to do. We're going to talk about all these particular Penstemons in turn here in a little bit. So I'll leave the pictures for now. Okay, what about Penstemons? In 1748, John Mitchell described the first one. Penstemon levigatus, eastern smooth Penstemon. Except he just called it Penstemon because it was before Linnaeus. So there weren't Latin binomials, there weren't two names, there wasn't a genus and a species. He just called it Penstemon. Well, Linnaeus came around and renamed it Cheyloni Penstemon. Only he had a T there. We'll talk about that T in a moment. Eventually, that T was dropped that you see in red there, and it ended up back being Penstemon. And Ayton named it Penstemon levigatus. I'm not sure how it ended up eastern smooth beard tongue, except if you translate levigatus, it comes out smooth anyway. Well, that was one. So we had one species of Penstemon in 1748. We had 4 by 1810. There were 63 by 1850. And then it exploded. In 1900, we had 163. And then you can't see it there at the bottom, but by the mid-20th century, we had 250 species. So the number of known species just has skyrocketed. Well, what about that word Penstemon? Again, Mitchell named it, and then it gained that T. And the reason it gained a T is because it was really named for the 5 stamens, and in particular, one really funky stamen. Lots of plants have 5 stamens. Stamens are what in a plant where the pollen comes from. They're made up of a filament, which is just a stalk to the anther, and the anther splits open, and that's where the pollen is released from. So this is a stamen, that is a filament, and that's the anther at the end, and the anther splits open and releases pollen. Well, there are 5 of them. Here's one really funky one. There are 2 here and 2 here. A little hard to see all 5 of them in that particular picture. But that really funky one doesn't release any pollen. It's a sterile stamen. In botany, I'm not going to unload very many botanical words on you, don't worry. But in botany, a sterile stamen is called a staminode. We'll be talking about that staminode. It's bearded. Look at all those hairs on it. That gives the genus its common name, beard tongue. And since there are 5 stamens, that in Greek is penta, you end up with Penstemon, pentastamen, Penstemon, and then the T was dropped, you end up with Penstemon. So I went poking around on SciNet. Some of you are familiar with SciNet. It's a great big database. And looked to see what I could find for the earliest collections, herbarium collections of Penstemons. Turns out there's quite a few. There's narrowleaf Penstemon over there on the left. That was collected by Charles Wright in 1851. He was on a survey of the Mexican-American border back then. Now, what you learn about Charles Wright is all of his location information is suspect. So whether he was really at Santa Rita or not, who knows? George Thurber, he was also on a border expedition, and he collected Penstemon variegatus, one bloom penstemon. You can find these on the web. These are both at the New York Botanical Garden. Early collections from around here. That's our most common penstemon, probably, Penstemon barbatus, the scarlet bugler over there on the left. It doesn't look very scarlet because it's 140 years old on that sheet. When I'm 140 years old, if I look that good, I'll be happy. And over here is Fendler's penstemon collected by Busby in 1881. Now, it turns out, if you're interested in a little bit of history, the people who collected plants in this area came from all walks of life. Most people who collected plants here were actually pretty well off, pretty well to do. Some of them were physicians, for that matter, from that very questionable walk of life. Some of you know I was a general surgeon for 20, 30 years. Fendler, Augustus Fendler, I don't know how much you know about Augustus Fendler. Fendler was close to homeless. He was a hermit, he was broke, and he traveled all over the place from friend's house to friend's house. He lived in cabins in the forest. And he came to New Mexico after meeting up with Asa Gray, who was a famous botanist. And he sent plants back to Asa Gray for money. Well, he collected these. They weren't called Penstemon Fendleri when he picked them, but these plants became known as Fendler's penstemon. From around here in 1881. Actually, Busby collected them. A few comments about what you can use for resources. I know you can't see these well, but that book is that book. Penstemons by Gene Heflin, with photographs by a young looking DeWitt Ivy. Some of you knew DeWitt, he's no longer with us, so this book is now out of print, but copies of it still float around, so you can still get it. The amazing thing about this book, it's got great photographs. They were taken with this, I don't recognize that antique there. You had to open it and put stuff in it, and you could, if you open it too fast, you ruined the stuff inside and all that. Anyway, he used a film camera. This was published in 1997. So he used a film camera to take his pictures and did a fantastic job. This book, anybody seen this besides me yet? This book was published about 1 or 2 months ago. Penstemon of Southeastern Colorado by Don and Donnie Barnett. It's a father and son duo. They're horticulturists. They sell plants in Colorado. They also have a book out on cactus. I've actually gone through this book pretty well. The overlap with our part of New Mexico is a little bit skimpy. 6 of our common ones are in there, and that's it. But the closer, of course, you get to northeast New Mexico, the more overlap you're going to have. Beautiful pictures in here also, and it's a bigger format book compared to the Heflins. More resources. If you're interested in gardening with penstemons, and I think a lot of you probably are, the American Penstemons. Does anybody belong to the American Penstemon Society already here? I'd recommend it. They've got a great website. And if you're interested in hints for growing penstemons in this area, I can't imagine there's a better resource than the American Penstemon Society. If you're just looking for great pictures of penstemons, the Wolf Lab of Ohio State University has great shots online. Okay, so what is a penstemon? How do we recognize a penstemon in the field? Well, if you're looking at the leaves, you can see on your far left, they're not always joined across the middle like that, but some of them are. They have leaves that are opposite. That means there are 2 leaves at each node. They don't have multiple leaflets. Okay. They're very, very commonly serrate or toothed along the margin. The flowers are tube-shaped and two-lipped. So they have an upper lip, a lower lip. The upper lip has two floral lobes, and the lower lip has 3. We already talked about the staminode, this sterile stamen. that can be bearded and can be broad. So this one is bearded and broad, but in other penstemons, it's not bearded and not broad. In fact, it's pretty inconspicuous in some of them. And remember, when they're sterile like these are, those are the parts that make the pollen. This one will make no pollen. How about the leaves? Okay. The leaves can be broad, as that one on the left. Again, there's two leaves that are joined across the center. They're not always like that. But they can be broad and shaped like the tip of a spear. We call that lanceolate or ovate. Those two words mean the same thing in botany. Or they can be needle-shaped. This is Penstemon, the pine leaf Penstemon. They have needle-shaped leaves. The names of all these are actually not showing up because of this bar here. I'll tell you what they are. Penstemons are perennial, but they don't always act that way in the garden. So they are short-lived perennials. They live 3 to 5 years or so in the wild, perhaps. And then they die. They reseed each other quite prolifically. They reseed themselves quite prolifically. They can be herbaceous, which is to say not woody at all, like that wand bloom Penstemon on the left, or they can be more woody toward the base, like this pine leaf Penstemon on the right, and they can be a lot woodier than that one. That's kind of a small plant. If you grow them in very cold or very hot environments, then they become annual or act like an annual. Lots of cool things about Penstemons. One of the cool things about Penstemons is that we can claim them as our own. They first evolved in the Rocky Mountains. They started here, or north of us, really. And then they did what botanists call radiating. They radiated out from there, and they populated suitable niches in the rest of North America and the northern tropics. I won't bore you with a lot of this, but for those of you who are interested in further information about this, in the past, Penstemon was divided into subgenera and even into species, really. And the keys were based upon how the pollen-making part of the stamen, that is to say the anther, how the anther split, how widely it split, how it was oriented when it split, and when it split. So all those factors went together, and you can see different orientations and different modes of splitting, how far open it goes, and so forth. These are the kinds of pictures you would have seen in 2006 that described the different subgenera and species of Penstemons, and you probably would have had to know about this to get some of these to species properly. Nowadays, at least scientifically, they use portions of genetic material. They use what's called the internal transference spacer between the small and large subunits of that code for the ribosomes, and they use some non-coding portions of chloroplast DNA. So if you want to figure out subgenera and relationships, evolutionary relationships between Penstemons now, you have to go to the DNA. That's not used as much anymore. And in terms of the DNA, they're having all kinds of issues trying to get this worked out. The relationships among Penstemon species is still not really well understood because the things that hamper good DNA work are rapid speciation, recent speciation, and a lot of hybridization. Those things make it difficult to come up with a well-supported phylogenetic tree. You know, all of those things are going on with Penstemons. This radiation that I talked about, that only happened between 3 and 30 million years ago. That's recent in biologic time. So it's a recent radiation that's happened. It's happened quickly. We've gotten 270 species in that period of time. One last note on the classification then. Some of you probably, if you've been watching Penstemons, have had them in your mind classified in a family called the Scrophulariaceae, the figwort family, right? And there's red figwort we have in the Gila on the left. Looks a little bit like a Penstemon, doesn't it? Easy to mistake it for a penstemon. In fact, I mistook it for a penstemon. It's actually a state listed plant. You're not allowed to pick it. I didn't realize it was a penstemon a long time ago. So what did I do? I picked it, brought it back here, dissected it, and figured out what it was, and vowed I'd never tell anybody I did it. So scruff floriaceae no longer, that's not where the penstemons are anymore. They're over here in the plantain family, believe it or not. Here's one of our native plantains. It looks a little bit more like the figwort than the plantain, but it's in the plantain family for molecular genetic reasons. One of the most interesting things, if not the most interesting thing about penstemons, is their coevolution with their pollinators. So all that radiation you saw, all the movement of species away from where they started out, what happened was the various pollinators that lived in the places it went to and the plants themselves co-evolved, and they became different colors, different shapes, and that funny staminode changed as well. In general, we can make some good generalities. If you look on the left, that's a typical insect pollinated penstemon. And the reason I say that is because it has a great landing zone. See those 3 lobes on the bottom that are nice and broad for an insect to land on? The flower is pointing right at you. So the flower is horizontal. Insect can land right on there. See all those hairs? Some of those hairs are on the staminode here, but some of them are even on the floral lobes. Okay? What are those hairs there for? Those hairs push the insect up against the fertile stamens you see up on top. So here are 2 somewhat longer, 2 somewhat shorter stamens with the anthers here. And when an insect tries to get in here, if that's a bee or a large fly, it's going to get pushed up by these hairs, and it's going to brush the last plant's pollen off on the style, which is right here. And then it's going to pick up pollen from the anthers just below it, and that plant gets pollinated and pollinates the next one. How about if you're a hummingbird? Can you get into that flower at all? Is your head going to get close to that? You're blocked, aren't you? So not a great strategy if you want to be pollinated by a hummingbird. We got hummingbirds in the West. What about this penstemon? Well, here we have the 3 lower lobes bent backwards. It'd be pretty hard for an insect to land here. It would be upside down. I guess they could. Okay. It's got a long, narrow floral tube compared to the one on the left. This one's got a tall, short, stout floral tube. Insects get in there pretty quick and pretty easy. Insects don't get into these very easy. Okay.
So the people at home are having trouble when you're walking over there talking, so you need to be talking into that. And then when you point, they want you to use
my cursor. I'll do it. So here, the floral tube is long and thin. That's perfect for a hummingbird's beak to get into. A hummingbird's head will fit in snug right to there. But what happens? As soon as the hummingbird's head gets to the style here, which is the part that connects to the ovary, which is how this plant gets fertilized and makes seeds. So as soon as the hummingbird gets here, it drops off pollen here on the sticky part of that style. My cursor keeps going away. There it is. And it picks up pollen from the anthers here as it dives in here and sticks its tongue down there and picks up nectar. So this flower is red because it attracts hummingbirds, and it has perfect anatomy to be pollinated by a hummingbird. Hummingbirds would have trouble on the left. Insects can still get in here into this flower, but hummingbirds prefer it. And hummingbirds, some of them can get into the purple blue one over here, the lawn bloom penstemon. But again, insects will do better over there. So this is not an exclusive thing. If you sit in front of these flowers, you'll see mostly in front of that red one, you'll get hummingbirds pollinating it, but there'll be some insects. And mostly on the left, in the blue one, you'll see insects going in there, but you'll get some hummingbirds successful also. Okay, so again, on the left there, that's an insect pollinated penstemon. That's Whipple's penstemon, Penstemon whippelanus, dusky penstemon. See those great landing lines, right? Those great landing guidelines, they call them, great guidelines in a landing zone that's horizontal, so an insect can land there easily and crawl in there. It's got a short floral tube. Insects have an easy time there. There's hairs on both the staminode, the sterile stamen in the bottom there, as well as on the floral lobes. So insects have no problem pollinating that flower on the left. On the right, that's Penstemon pseudospectabilis. That's a picture from Mogollon Creek. Those flowers aren't horizontal. You see they're dangling almost vertically. They've got virtually no landing zone, no guidelines, and it's a real long tube. So those flowers on the right, those are meant for hummingbirds. Hummingbirds go crazy with Penstemon pseudospectabilis. What's the common name of that? Desert penstemon. So if you want hummingbirds to be coming to your penstemon, get a red penstemon that has a hanging down flower, you'll get the hummingbirds. If you want all kinds of bees and flies and wasps, get the horizontal penstemons that have blue, white, or purple flowers. Another evolutionary character for hummingbird pollinated penstemons is they grow tall. We have hummingbird feeders at our house. We've had to train our dogs to chase roadrunners. Well, why do we do that? I'm a bird guy and a flower guy. Well, you all know that roadrunners eat hummingbirds? They do. And we don't want to be hanging up our hummingbird feeders to feed the roadrunners. So we have to do things to make it harder for the roadrunners to get to the hummingbirds. It isn't just roadrunners that eat hummingbirds. They don't want to be low to the ground. These hummingbirds want to be higher off the ground so that they are less susceptible to predation. So most hummingbird pollinated penstemons will be taller, as opposed to that sand penstemon on the left there, Penstemon ambiguous. That's an interesting penstemon, by the way. It seems to pop up as a volunteer all over the place. It popped up at our house about 10 or 15 years ago, and then this disappeared about 5 years later. And I noticed that it's in the median between Socorro and Albuquerque on I-25 every year. I don't know if they planted it there, if it just comes up as a volunteer. But each one of those stems on the sand penstemon is only about 12 inches tall, max. So those are quite low to the ground. Insects can get at those very easily. And they are not hummingbird pollinated to any great extent. There's a nice flat landing zone that sticks out. The flowers are white. It turns out that the back side of the lobes are pink. So they can show a little pink, but they're basically white. Well adapted for insects. This is not my picture. I wish it were. Yeah, there are exceptions. So as I said, some of the penstemons that are adapted for insect pollination will be occasionally pollinated by hummingbird and vice versa. This plant, you can't get a more narrow floral tube in a less convenient landing zone. So the pine needle penstemon, Penstemon pinifolius, really is adapted for hummingbirds. But look how low that is to the ground. It rarely is taller than about 6 inches, maybe 8 inches. But here there's a compromise because this plant grows at upper elevation amongst the rocks. It's exposed to high wind a lot of the time. So if it had a tall inflorescence, it would be blown over as soon as the wind came up. So here you have to have, there's an exception. It simply has to go with the flow, as it were. If you are into cultivating, or if you're into growing special penstemons, my own feeling would be get a local penstemon. They do better. You don't have to give them as much water, but this particular penstemon, the pine needle penstemon, is one of the few penstemons you can buy that's yellow. So most penstemons, especially our local ones, are white, blue, or purple, or red if it's a hummingbird, or red or orange if they're hummingbird pollinated. You don't find too many yellow penstemons. It's not a common color in the genus. But you can see one down there. That was actually developed in England, and subsequently it's been sold around the world as a cultivar. I don't know of any green or black penstemons. Okay, so just a few of our penstemons around here. Here is Metcalf's penstemon. It was named after O.B. Metcalf, Oric Baylor Metcalf. He was a rancher early on in Mangus Springs and became a miner. He died in the 1930s in a mining accident around here. And if you want to pay respects to Metcalf, you can. He's buried at Memory Lane Cemetery and has a headstone you can still see there. This is named after him. This is Metcalf's penstemon. It's beautiful. It's unfortunately quickly going extinct. So if you want to see it, you got to see it soon. There were 3 populations of this plant. The only place it's known from is the Gila. And there are only 3 places in the Gila where you could find it. The main one was in a canyon south of Kingston. But that canyon, the canyon itself didn't burn with the silver fire. But the subsequent flooding, the next rainy season we had, flooded out the canyon, and none of those, that canyon had over 1,000 individuals of Metcalf's penstemon in it, and all those are gone. So what's left is a couple much smaller populations, one of which is on the Crest Trail north of Emery Pass, and another one is in the area of North Percha Creek. It's a beautiful penstemon. Do you think it's insect pollinated or hummingbird pollinated? With all those hairs there? Yeah. And a great landing zone, purple. Usually, it's actually a bicolor penstemon you see in the wild. You can see a little bit of that on the left picture there. When the flowers are older than a few hours old, they turn from a blue to a pink and blue, and they're really pretty. But I would call this a pretty straightforward, mostly insect pollinated penstemon. Here's our most common penstemon, scarlet bugler, Penstemon barbatus. It's bright red. It has a long, narrow floral tube. The landing zone is virtually non-existent. It's bent backwards, those 3 lobes on the lower lip. So this is another very clearly, mostly hummingbird pollinated penstemon. And it has a tall inflorescence that's frequently held several feet above the ground. I've seen these as tall as 4 or 5 feet. In addition, this is for all penstemons now. I put this picture of the fruit here. This is a capsule in the lower right. That's the fruit of a penstemon. Notice that it has a little crease down the middle, not really a crease so much as a visible wall down the middle of it. It has a 2-chambered fruit. The reason that's important, if you're into flowers, if you want to collect seed in the Gila, for instance, I'm not telling you to do that. I'm not sure it's legal. But if some little bird told you to collect some seed from things in the Gila, you would be wise to look for a 2-chambered fruit for penstemons, because there are phlox. We have native phlox family plants that look very much like penstemons. It would be nice to have them as well. But if you're looking for a penstemon, not a phlox, go for the 2-chambered fruit and not the 3-chambered fruit of the phlox. What about our lower elevations? Upper elevations, you can see some of what we've seen already. The Penstemon pinifolius, pseudospectabilis is upper elevation, or at least middle elevation. Here is Penstemon fendleri. This is the one that was named after the guy who really didn't have a good home. I haven't seen these up. I'm a little concerned for them. This year has not been a particularly good year for Penstemons yet. It's early. The rains aren't close yet. And the color on that screen, by the way, is not matching the color here very well. So that you're seeing a deep purple there. It should be more of a pink purple than that. Those of you who are familiar with Fendler's Penstemon know that this color is just a little bit off. nonetheless, if you look at it, not a very long floral tube, guidelines, relatively flat, purple-ish. Okay, so another insect pollinated penstemon, and held up fairly high on a floral stalk on the inflorescence. I should let Don and Wendy talk about this one. This is a penstemon that's the most recent one added to our list, known from our area. Don and Wendy found this. This was growing on a street that had recently been put in, I guess. The lots along it had recently been bulldozed. And I guess this was probably seeded, I don't know. It could have been volunteers, or it could have been seeded by the Mexican Department of Transportation. Did you guys ever find out? No? I don't know if this was put there. It's certainly doing well. They say it's still there now. So this has been there for a few years. It grows, I think we had some of these 5 or 6 feet tall, Palmer's penstemon. Very luxuriant growth. This would make a great yard plant. It's growing in people's yards. They don't even have the yard there yet. Grows at Fort Baird. Yeah. If you look at the flower, it's a little pink, but basically not very bright pink. It's got guidelines. It's got a flat landing zone. If you can see these flowers in the field, and you can see a little bit over there, it's got short, stocky flowers. It does not have a relatively long floral tube, and it's probably mostly insect pollinated. And it has the densely hairy staminode or beard tongue. All those things are insect pollinated coevolution. Here's another one of our more common upper elevation plants. Again, this should be a little bit more pink than it's showing there. This is wand bloom. I have no idea where that name came from. Wand bloom. I don't even know what that means, really. Wand bloom penstemon. Penstemon virgatus. It grows all over the Pinos Altos. It grows at our house, actually, as a volunteer, just below our house. It's herbaceous, though it is a perennial, short-lived perennial. It has those wonderful guidelines, has a landing zone. It's a short, stubby, thick floral tube. This is insect pollinated for the most part also. There's another lower elevation penstemon. This is narrow-leaf penstemon, Penstemon linearioides. It's also got guidelines, and it's got a nice landing zone. It's got hairy lobes to the lower lip. It's got a hairy staminode. This is another insect pollinated plant. Incidentally, you can see the 5 stamens here. Here's the sterile one, the staminode. Oh, you want me on here? Here's the staminode, and these 4 guys are the 4 anthers. And in textbooks, I don't know why they do this. In botany, if you have 2 long and 2 short stamens, that's called tetradynamous. That's a word you don't need to know. But they call this a tetradynamous arrangement because the 2 long and 2 short stamens up there. The problem is that's ignoring this 5th stamen down here. Right? So really those people who are calling this tetradynamous are, I think, pretty much incorrect. And here's Penstemon pseudospectabilis. This is common along waterways especially. This thing is a beautiful penstemon in the lower parts, at least, of Mogollon Creek between about Redstone and the catwalk. It's got these wonderful, you've seen a picture of this already today. It's got these beautiful hanging down red flowers. And when they're hanging like that, they don't have a landing zone. It's a beautiful example of a hummingbird pollinated flower. And here's sand penstemon again. You've seen this. It's a beautiful example of an insect pollinated flower. It's white, has a beautiful landing zone. It has a little bit longer floral tube than you might expect, but it sits low to the ground. Penstemon seeds don't really even look like seeds. They're usually angular like this, and they look more like rocks, little pebbles sometimes, than they look like seeds. Those of you who know me know that I'm not much of a gardener. So I don't want to take too much credit for this. Cut off at the bottom here is the website I got these hints from. So I put this here because I know if I don't say something about Penstemons in the garden that somebody is going to ask me. So this is my attempt. This is the mea culpa if I don't know that much about gardening. What I read was that Penstemons in the garden are drought and heat resistant and deer and rabbit resistant. They said that they are not snail and slug resistant. And apparently the biggest mistake you can make with Penstemons in the garden is overwatering them. They like full sun. They do not do well if they're closely planted to other species. The hybrids need more water. And another subject that I knew I was going to be asked about if I didn't preempt it first was uses of Penstemons by Native Americans and what ethnobotanical uses there might be of Penstemons. What can they be used for medicinally? I don't really know the answer to that myself. So this is again from the web. This is from the Native American ethnobotany database. It's all right down here, unfortunately being covered up. So it turns out most Penstemons are used for something, but this particular one, the scarlet bugler, seems to be used for the most things by the most people. The Navajo, I'm picking on them because they used it for the most. The Navajo used it for all kinds of stuff. And I love some of this. They used it for menstrual pain and stomachache. They used it for burns and for cough. I kind of like this one. I wonder what it did for gunshot wounds and bow and arrow wounds. I kind of like this one too. I guess they meant the nectar is sucked from the flower by pregnant women to keep the babies small. It's interesting. We really don't try to keep babies small in medicine. And then for leg fractures. And that's all I have for you. Questions? Lights? I have no idea how long I went because my phone is off. How did I do on time? 42. Okay. Yes, ma'am. This is Corinne. Corinne. If you don't know Corinne, she's new to the area. Anybody else new to the area here? Is she the only person? Who else has never been to a Gila Native Plant Society meeting? Lots of people. Stand up. Stand. You three, stand up so we can say hi to you all. You can't, but you guys. So this is Corinne Lambden. She's just moved here from San Francisco area, Alameda. I know that because I've talked to her about it. Okay, so sorry about that, ladies and gentlemen of the ether. The question was, what about the hairs? And I think I can find some of them. There we go. So it's a little hard to see with the lights on again. So knock those lights down, Don, again. And if you look up here in the upper right, you can see a whole bunch of hairs on the outside of that floral tube. Is that what you're asking about, Corin? So those hairs are glandular. Glands in virtually every, you can't quite see it, but there's little golf balls on the end of those hairs. So you're looking at what looks like a golf ball on a tee under the microscope when you look at those hairs. A little hard to see in that picture because it's not magnified long enough. And those hairs are making chemicals that either smell good to a pollinator or smell bad to a herbivore. Usually they either attract or try to dissuade something from coming in. In the case of the Penstemon, I'm guessing that they smell good to an insect, but I don't know that for a fact. So the question was, here we go, coming from Leslie Mansfield, who I imagine is up in Santa Fe at this point. Leslie wants to know why this Penstemon is dwindling in numbers. Well, the most recent reason is because of the fire and the flood. Beyond that, the main reason I think why in the plant world, it has a lot to do with pollinators. So I don't know exactly which insects are pollinating this flower, but there's a pretty good bet that the co-evolved pollinators is having a problem. I don't know if it's insecticide related or some other issue, but there's a pretty good bet that it's habitat destruction or pollinator decrease in number. Cool. Well, that's when they should have been there. I've been, well, actually the Gila Native Plant Society was down at Pitchfork Ranch about 2-3 weeks ago, weren't we? And they should have been there, at least in that area. So in some of the places you'd expect them, I would have expected to see them on the drive down to the Pitchfork, even if not at the Pitchfork. But they haven't been up, and I suspect we may not see them because the time for them to bloom is rapidly going. So if it rains now, we might see the plants. We might not see them in bloom. Anybody here seen this Penstemon in bloom this year?
Yes.
Where?
On Boston Hill, the trail behind the animal shelter.
Cool. I think that's where Wendy said the chat box person had seen it also, same basic area. So somewhere there has got a good enough amount of water and good enough habitat. What else? Anything out of the chat room? Oh, almost always. Yeah. So the question was, can you see the pistil? Which what he really means is the style and stigma. Can you see the style and stigma sticking out without having to tear the plant apart? The answer is usually yes to that. Because if you think about it, from a natural selection point of view, these plants need to be pollinated before they put their own pollen on an insect or a hummingbird. So it's more efficient if that style is sticking out further than the anthers. So usually that style is either equal or just past the anthers. And mostly I would imagine to be the same way with Sua spectabilis. I think you can hit the lights on. We can take questions from the gallery. So there's the Penstemons in the garden. I'm sure virtually everybody in this room knows more about gardening Penstemons than I do. So.
You know, when Russ gets to the part of his program where he's talking about Penstemons in the garden, you know his presentation is just about over.
There are a lot of things I know about plants. There are a lot of things I don't know about plants. And
Emily.
So Emily has noted that it seems like a long time from when the fruit is formed to when the valves at the top open. It probably is a reasonable amount of time. You know, I've never seen the valves open when they were green, for instance. So those capsules have to mature, and as they mature, they turn brown. I've never seen them open. I've seen a lot of green Penstemon capsules. I think they're immature at that point, and they have to mature. I think mostly they open up in the late summer, early autumn, most of the species, and they wait for we get these horrible winds in this area in the springtime, but we also have them come back again around Thanksgiving. You ever notice that? And I think a lot of those winds at Thanksgiving spread a lot of these seeds around. By the time December comes around, you don't find many seeds left in capsules. So there's mindfulness to their madness. Oh, that's an interesting question. Is anybody trying to propagate Metcalf's Penstemon, which is the one, in case you've forgotten, that's the one that's clearly in danger in our area of going extinct? You would think so. I don't know the answer. That's a good question. I know who to ask, though. Yeah, well, there's a long story. It's a long story to this. I've been to all the places where this Penstemon is at, and we didn't know it to be along the crest trail until the big population got destroyed, and it suddenly seemed to, it was probably there all along, but we finally noticed along the crest trail. The North Percha population has been there all along. It's probably at risk because where it used to grow was on a bench above a creek. I'm not going to tell you exactly where because I don't know who all is listening, but it was on a bench above a creek, and with the flooding, that bench collapsed into the creek. And the Penstemon continued to grow on the bench in the creek. How long that will last, no one knows. When we went to survey the population that was south of Kingston, I'll tell this story just for the fun of it. We went up, the New Mexico State rare plant person and I went up in a Forest Service truck. We were 11 miles off road, getting close to where that population is. And it rained the night before. The bench that the road went on collapsed, and we collapsed down into the creek with the bench with one tire still hooked onto the top. We were almost vertical in this truck. We climbed out, we roped the truck to a juniper, and then walked out 11 miles. And Karen, where'd Karen go? Karen?
Very understanding life when big come up.
And she had to drive for what, 2 hours to come again. And so I called her and said, I'm going to hitchhike home. And she said, oh yeah, right. Anyway, so I don't know if anybody's propagating it. I think I might have heard about that if it was happening. So I tend to doubt it.
So folks at home, this was our first try at a hybrid. And thank you to the gentleman or the gal who told us that Russ needed to talk into his microphone here and not walk off stage. And he needed to use his cursor. But what I want to know is what went well and what went not well so that we can improve if we have to do this again. So you can use our Gila Native @gmail.com and just send us, just use the same email that you sent to request. The recording is stopped. Okay. Anyway, good night, everybody. Thank you.